Hello, my name's Dick Hardt, and I'm going to talk to you about IPSIE and how you can have less oopsie with IPSIE. A little of my background: serial entrepreneur, founded a number of companies, active state after porting Perl 5 to Windows, and then I got heavy into identity with Skip Identity, and then most recently founder of Hello Identity. Had a tour of duty at Microsoft, spent some time in AWS and Alexa, led the design of OAuth 2, JSON Web Tokens, and currently working on OAuth 2.1, IPSIE, and OP commands. So what is IPSIE? Why should you care? And what are the current challenges in enterprise identity and access management? And how will IPSIE profile solve them? And at the end, I'm going to do some Q&A. So IPSIE is an OpenID Foundation working group and stands for Interoperability Profiling for Secure Identity and in the Enterprise. And at the end, there'll be profiles for things like SAML, OpenID Connect, OIDC, SCIM, OP commands. And the objective of IPSIE is how do we make it more secure doing identity types of things with enterprises? So that was a lot of acronym soup there. So let's go into a little more detail about that. So there's single sign-on, often called SSO. And it is done by two different protocols: SAML, the Security Assertion Markup Language, and OIDC, OpenID Connect, which is built on OAuth 2.0. Often you'll hear people talk about OAuth and OpenID Connect interchangeably, but if they're talking about logging in and getting an ID token, they're really talking about OpenID Connect. The other aspect of enterprise identity and access management is directory synchronization. So one of those protocols, and the one that's widely deployed for doing that, is called SCIM, System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. And a new one that I'm working on with a number of other people, OP commands, or OpenID Provider Commands. And I'll provide a little more detail on what OP commands is later on in this talk. Enterprise Identity Access Management Protocols. And so here's how they fit together. So at the top, we've got your user, your employee, and they log in from the enterprise, often also called the identity provider or OpenID provider. And they log in from there, and then they end up at the application and providing a token of some kind or assertion that establishes who they are. So the application, AKA service provider, SP, AKA relying party, RP, knows which user they are. That token may also include claims about the user, such as their email address, their name, which groups they belong to, and things like SAML could also include their department or location. Directly between the identity service, the enterprise, and the application is a protocols that work on directly managing the users that are in the application. So one of those protocols is SCIM, and the other one is OP commands. And so why do enterprises want this? They want centralized identity management. And this allows users, they log in just one place, but they can control how users log in. So they have strong authentication and they can have high confidence that it's really their user, as opposed to the user logging into the application with a different set of credentials that the enterprise doesn't have management of. Having centralized identity management allows them to make a change once and it's reflected everywhere. It allows them to go and look in the directory and, in general, with some caveats, know who has access to what for compliance and security, so they can have certainty that only the people that are allowed to have access to certain information do have access to that information and that functionality. And centralized management also simplifies onboarding and offboarding. So in a modern organization, they may have hundreds of applications, and depending on the role of the user, they have different rights and access to different applications. And so by having it centrally managed, they can add a user and delete a user, and those changes are reflected in all the applications. So there's a maturity curve here around how an enterprise might be using an application. So initially we start with PLG, product-led growth, where some users are just self-serve signing up for an application. It isn't managed by the organization yet. And in this case, the users may be using a username and password or social login, maybe their GitHub account or their Google account. And then we move into where the enterprise is starting to manage the user, where we just have basic single sign-on. In this case, the application knows which user it is, and when the user is no longer an employee, they can no longer log in. And so this enables you to take away access. That's when people leave, and enables you to ensure that people are authenticating strongly, which helps prevent account takeovers. The next step in the curve is what we call just-in-time provisioning, where those tokens on login also include things like somebody's email address, their name, the groups they belong to, etc. And so on the first time that the application sees the user is provisioned. So just-in-time provisioning is the third phase. And then in the last phase is where we start to be synchronizing between the central directory and the application. So whenever there's a change in the directory, that gets reflected out into all the applications. So enterprise SSO with SAML in the industry, we often talk about that it's a choose your own adventure. SAML is a framework that lets you do many different things because people had many different requirements when it was created. And you can configure it to go and include certain pieces of information, include different credentials. You can name things different things depending on how you wanted things named. So you can have a different label for a name or for the manager, things like that. So it's very empowering in many ways that you can kind of do anything. The downside is that you can kind of do anything, and that you're also very worried, or the security team's worried about bad things that might happen. And so they come up with different things that they hope will prevent a bad thing from happening. And so what you end up with is the enterprise has sort of decided, hey, here's what our security profile is. Here's what you need to do if you want your application to go and connect to our enterprise. And each of these enterprises is fairly unique, and some of the security requirements are disconnected from each other, right? So you end up with something that's, pretty funky looking for each enterprise at the end of the day. And often these requirements, there's gaps in these requirements for when you as a developer are out there building and deploying this, right? It's not clear, what should I do here? What should I do there? Because there are so many choices, at times those aren't specified, and so it isn't really clear what you should do. And so that makes it difficult to build and deploy these things because each one of them is custom. And there's no conformance test for SAML, right? Because it can do so many different things, you can't just run this test to say, hey, did I do it right? And that leads to gaps between different systems and processes and holes in the whole system. And at times that leads to an IPSIE, where somebody that is unauthorized has access to resources in some way. So let's talk about IPSIE and how IPSIE solves that. So IPSIE has profiles. This is my best idea that I could come up with for a picture of a profile. And the profiles are current best practices around security and interop between the application and the enterprise. And so these are very opinionated specs that say, here's the different things you need to do. The profiles will have conformance testing, so you can test to see whether your application and the enterprise do the right things. And you can have certifications so that you can prove to other people that it does conform. And then there's different maturity levels depending on the requirements of the enterprise and the application. And so some of those levels, one of the dimensions is the session lifecycle, essentially like somebody logging in and getting logged out. And so there are 3 levels in session lifecycle, SL1, SL2, SL3. And the levels, there's what does the application need to do and what does the identity service need to do at each level to make sure that they are mapping to each other and that you're meeting a certain level of security in the session lifecycle. The other dimension in IPSIE is the identity lifecycle, which is around managing the accounts and who can do what. In IL1, you're just managing users and deleting users. In IL2, you're starting to have groups. And so you have more granular control over who can do what, that when you essentially change membership in a group, that gets reflected to the applications as to what people can do. And so at the application, you map a group that's a horizontal concept in the enterprise to the vertical concept of what you can do at each application. So that mapping between functionality in the application or role in the application is mapped at the application to groups. IL3 moves that a layer deeper where the application exposes the roles that it has and the identity service looks at those roles and all of the information it has about a given user and decides which roles at an application each user has. Currently, there's only a couple of initial drafts for IPSIE. There's an OpenID Connect SL1 and the start of a SCIM IL1. Now let me talk to you about OpenID Provider Commands as I hinted at earlier. In contrast to SCIM, which requires the application to set up an OAuth server or something like that to manage the SCIM API. The SCIM API is a set of REST calls to manage the resources at an application. OP Commands is quite a bit simpler. And you generate a token that contains a command, and that token is validated the same as an ID token. So if you're already supporting OpenID Connect with the enterprise, supporting OP Commands is a small step to start to be able to go and provide account lifecycle types of functionality. And it's important to note that these are commands, not events. The OP, the enterprise, is saying, I want you, the application, to do that, to do a particular thing. And the first command that an OP will give is a metadata command where the OP gets a list of what commands the RP, the application, supports. This enables the OP to say, hey, do you support all the commands that I want you to support to be compliant for my security policies? And if the RP doesn't, the OP can decide, well, I'm not going to give you any ID tokens for the user to log in because you don't support the things that I need you to support. For example, one of those could be the next command on the list, the unauthorized command. This functionality isn't well represented in anything in standards today. The unauthorized command enables the OP to go and tell all of its RPs, I want you to unauthorize any access this one user has. The reason for that is, with the rise of breaches, is that the OP may be suspecting that some malicious user or has taken over a device or the account of a given user and wants to make sure everything gets cleaned up, particularly in today where it might be a mobile app or some long-lived session that isn't really tied to a web session. The attacker might have gotten access to resources and a logout doesn't clean that up. And so the unauthorized command would enable you to clean everything up. The way people do that now is a very brute force approach with SCIM, where they effectively disable and re-enable the account, which is sort of like turning on and off the switch on your computer to clean everything up. The next command is the audit command. This enables the OP to see, hey, what users do you have for me? What's the state of all those users to make sure that I'm in sync? It's also super helpful in a migration because it's rare that you'll start off with the enterprise just starting to go and manage the users. you might have had PLG users that are signed up, logged in with their emails from the enterprise initially, and now the enterprise wants to manage it. So the audit command would enable the OP to say, hey, which of my users do you have? And I'm going to take over management of all of those accounts. And then we have a bunch of commands that enable account lifecycle management that's much richer than what's in SCIM, which is really enable and disable. And so those follow the standardized ISO account lifecycle of changing around between different states. So instead of just deleted and active, you can archive, you can suspend account, which is maps much more to richer life cycles that many enterprises have. So in summary, what have we talked about? Well, one of those is that if you're in B2B SaaS, your customers are going to require enterprise integration at some point. Not all customers, your early adopters will go and use it without that, but at some point you're going to need to be enterprise ready, and the enterprise is going to say, I can't use your application unless it has this capabilities. And that will particularly happen as your application becomes more important to the enterprise. The next point we learned is like just doing SSO is super vague. People say, I want SSO, and someone says, I'll give you SSO. But what that means is very vague, and it's very different for different enterprises. IPSIE is coming out with different levels that are crisp and secure. And so you could say, I support IPSIE SL2, and the enterprise says, yep, that's what I need. That dramatically will lower the costs in selling and make it easy to deploy because we'll have standardized a number of different levels as opposed to each of those being different. And of course, one of the huge benefits of IPSIE is we'll probably get a lot less oopsie. So if you'd like to know more about IPSIE, you can find the working group on the OpenID.net site at this URL. You can also follow along look at the existing standards. If you're interested, we'd love other people to come in and participate and provide feedback in the working group. It's a public forum. People can go and file issues there. And if you want to learn more about what I'm doing at Hello, feel free to drop me an email at dickhart@hello.coop. Thank you.